This is a portion of a quote by Mickey Scott B. Jones that I always find helpful when I'm thinking about how groups of people from all different backgrounds and identities can come together for one purpose. We will not be perfect. This space will not be perfect, but it will not always be what we wish it to be, but it will be our brave space together, and we will work on it side by side. Steph says, elevate voices not commonly listened to. Commit to breaking down all types of barriers.
People think that there are some people who are too disabled to really live in the community or to live on their own because they need a lot of services. And so again, explaining that no, we know that community living is something that anyone can do, including people who need a lot of help all the time. But we have to get the services lined up correctly. And that's the problem we should focus on, as opposed to, again, trying to find another place to put someone away from the community.
Home and community-based services basically address the needs of the individual and build their support system within the community in which they live.
Lots of things affect how healthy someone can be. And some of these things are having a safe and stable housing, having social support like your friends and family, being able to get healthy food and living somewhere with clean air, having money to buy what you need to stay healthy, and having a job that's safe to do.
For the fiscal year 2018 to 2019, out of all the individuals who applied for housing and additional support services, about 20% were able to successfully get it. And then the rest have been put onto a wait list or possibly other types of services.
Some states have waiting lists that are like 10 or 15 years long. Other states are better. California is pretty complicated when we're talking about that. And not all people with disabilities qualify for Medicaid. Medicaid has very sort of narrow ideas about what counts as a disability. So a lot of people with disabilities who need help in their day-to-day lives still aren't able to get Medicaid, so they can't get those home and community-based services. So I think a really important advocacy strategy is to start collecting those successful stories so that we can show them to people and help them imagine a different world.
So one of our fundamental goals as an architect is to make sure everybody, including people with disabilities, can use buildings safely and comfortably. And the way we see it is that inclusive design, meaning designing for as many people as possible, is good design.
So for me, accessibility includes cognitive accessibility and sensory accessibility and emotional accessibility so that my brain can function well enough within its environment without causing too many problems. So to understand how to design the most accessible living environment for any given person, you have to think about not only that person's physical needs, but their mental needs and emotional needs too.
I like to talk about in terms of harmonizing different needs and potentially conflicting things, and sometimes they're just conflicts.
Yeah.
And you know, within the blindness community itself, most that are low vision have benefit from higher levels of light, of illumination, but that's not all of them. Many are light sensitive, and so it's, you know, you've got to know how to address one situation at a particular time, and how to allow. There's a principle of universal design of flexibility and use, allowing for that flexibility to adapt the environment to your particular needs.
There's a common misconception that incorporating universal design is going to cost more money. And that's a historic issue. Ever since the 90s, when these laws were passed, people said, I can't do this, it's too expensive. But what I've often found is if you start really early in the design process, thinking about these things conceptually, then it doesn't become overly expensive to incorporate them.
I think people often forget that design at the end of the day is about making things more human. And that's just the absolute direction that we're moving in. And the more time we spend on design, the more thought we're putting into how our built environment is getting put together.
I think there's no substitute for the kind of community that can happen in a more urban setting. The support and services and education and access to jobs and access to transit. I mean, all that support network is important for everybody. And it's also really important to people with disabilities, maybe even more so in some cases. And so I think it's really that access to support and access to community that makes cities so important.
We have tenant protection, we have the preservation of existing housing, and we have the production of new housing. And those three pieces are really key and core to what we understand as strong housing policy in the state. And you'll see a lot of the measures that come out of the legislature are around those issues. Types of reform have been a big part of the conversation. First, approval reforms, making building housing cost less money. How do we make it cheaper? And that includes not just reducing fees at the local level, but also making sure that developments go through the process quickly, because with development, time is money. And then zoning reforms, making it easier to build housing, making sure that the local allowances on zoning at the local level are permissive enough to build all types of housing.
I am quite concerned that we have policies that, it's either 100% affordable with a stack of publicly oriented subsidies to make that affordable, or it's very high-end market rent, and that our collection of policies, land use policies, financing policies, don't make it easy to have a better mix within a development, but also just to have more moderate income housing, because we're driving to this, what I call the barbell effect. And if you're lucky to win that subsidy lottery, great. And if you're not rich, then too bad. There's no place for you. And it's like the hollowing out of people in the middle that is of concern to me.
I noticed when I started in this space that there was actually both a lot of ableism and a lot of kind of anti-poverty built into how we talked about housing for people with disabilities. So often people would frame their project as, don't worry, this won't be those poor people, it'll be non-threatening disabled people. And it was incredibly angering and frustrating. And even though I think people were trying to do it for the goal of getting housing built, they were actually playing right into ableist stereotypes and also saying really bad things about low-income people in general that didn't have disabilities. And really the only way to solve this right is to actually have disabled voices be the ones at the community meeting, and actually have people with disabilities themselves talking about their housing need in a neighborhood, and people with disabilities themselves showing up and talking about why this community is important to serve a diverse population.
So many people, even when they live in affordable housing, even when they live at our properties, are rent burdened. That means they pay more than 30% of their income towards rent. If they pay more than 50% of their income towards rent, they're considered extremely rent burdened. And we as a nonprofit landlord, we really try to keep that from happening.
There truly is an abundance of resources when it comes to housing. In my city alone, there are 8,000 houseless people and an estimated 57,000 vacant homes and vacation rentals. Huge amounts of money are in circulation in this industry every year. With this much abundance, no person should be houseless.
Less than 40% of people who qualify for Section 8 receive it. Locally, you can see that only 2 to 5% of eligible people receive Section 8, and not even everyone at SSI has it. The waiting list is 14 years long in my county.
Wealth in this country has traditionally been passed through home ownership. There have been a number of policies from the federal government as well as practices from the financial services industry where Black people were not allowed to purchase homes in neighborhoods that would appreciate. And now that legally we can, in many cases, it has become a false right because we don't have the generations of wealth building that allows that to happen. So I just wanted to kind of put that acknowledgement on the table that, yes, our communities do not have the large amount of resources to, on their own, typically be able to implement these types of projects.
But either way, it's just everyone coming together and presenting the opportunity that we may have and seeing how we can work together to make sure these become a reality.
Recognizing that housing is also racial justice. We can't achieve housing justice if we don't achieve racial justice. And part of that is because the foundation of our housing policies in the United States were really based on structural racism and frankly, anti-Black and Indigenous racism. So in my work, trying to address the homelessness and housing crisis here in the Bay Area, it has been critically important for us to lift up the fact that Black, Brown, and Indigenous people are disproportionately impacted by housing insecurity, by homelessness, by ableism. And so it's really critical to me that when we talk about housing justice, they are inextricably linked in our quest to achieve racial justice.
Social justice means fairness and rights, opportunities, and treatment of all people. So intersectionality is a term or idea by Kimberly Crenshaw. Intersectionality is the concept that all oppression and every kind of discrimination is linked or connects us together to each other. It is an acknowledgement that everyone has their own unique experiences of discrimination and oppression, that we must consider everything and anything that can marginalize people, such as race, gender, class, sexual orientation, identity, or disability.
You know, the Black home ownership rate is like at 40% in the United States, where white home ownership rates are at like 71%. That is not an accident. That is a direct result of housing policy.
Some data to kind of reflect on is that 17% of Native Americans and 25% of Asian Americans, 31% of Latinos, and 45% of African Americans report experiencing discrimination when trying to rent or buy housing. By contrast, just 5% of white Americans report experiencing housing discrimination. So we know that racial bias not only undermines access to housing, but also can affect property values.
There continues to be denial around the impacts and reality that structural racism exists, that anti-Blackness, Black racism in particular exists, that we have, intentionally designed housing policies that exclude folks with disabilities, other marginalized communities, and that those things still show up today. If we were excluded from acquiring land and home ownership, how does government intervention make that much more possible? So I appreciate you putting that on the table, because we often don't see a pathway for our low income and extremely low income folks as well as our other marginalized brothers and sisters to be able to move out of poverty and into stability.
Housing is a justice issue. It's also a public safety issue. It's a quality of life issue. It's an equity issue. And the more that we look at all of the different things that really come out of having a safe and usable shelter, the more you realize, I think, that in order to say that if you believe that people have a right to exist, that you also have to believe that they have a right to do that in a safe home and in a usable home.
Frankly, the individuals with the disabilities, as well as other people who are advocates, those of us who are on this panel, and others, must continue to say that people with disabilities deserve to be at the table. People with disabilities deserve to be at decision-making spaces, and no matter what their disability is, no matter how many disabilities they have.
And the building is going to get built, and there will be 100 units of affordable, accessible housing built there this fall. A lot of what moved, I think, people, because the tropes that people used were to try to delay the housing is like nobody none of these people, they're telling us about our neighborhood, they're telling us we're racist, and these people aren't from here. And so a lot of what we did was we had clips of people telling stories of like, we would love to be your neighbors, but you've never built housing that we could move into. Like, we either can't afford it or it's not accessible.
It's always so difficult to find the perfect match of affordable housing that's also accessible, and accessible not just being accessible kind of building wise and internally, but also accessible in terms of public transportation, access to food, access to health and medical care.
And I think through radical grassroots organizing, I've realized that I can be holistically myself and unapologetically myself. And I take that with me wherever I go. And to Eric's point, like in the past where I've written to state senators and done policy stuff, it's always been in a way to reclaim spaces, not only for myself, but for other QT BIPOC folks and folks with disabilities.
We cannot do advocacy alone in whatever way, whether it's within the system or outside of the current system. We cannot do this work alone. We have to find other groups that advocate for affordable housing or whatever critical housing issue that you want to focus on.
But discrimination, not as something that holds us back, but something that elevates our awareness of the failures or the shortcomings that, once addressed collectively, can propel us all forward. We are part of a multi-generational struggle for social justice. We are soldiers for equity and human rights. And we are, through our lived experience, experts that hold power and can speak truth to power to influence our immediate surroundings, and together with a broader network to help influence the trajectory of the planet.